presenter is Katelyn Sullivan, who's presenting a paper entitled Rationality and Ethics in the Will to Believe. Thanks, Katelyn.
So this paper primarily centers around William James's famous essay, The Will to Believe. And my thesis is that James's arguments cannot be used to justify theistic belief based on the ethical ramifications that would be involved. There are some other components to my thesis as well, especially how he treats other thinkers on this topic, but that's what's most relevant to this conference. So I want to do a little bit of background first. So William James was a psychologist and a philosopher, among a lot of other things. So he wrote the essay under discussion, and in it he attempts to justify religious belief and provide a rational basis for it. And one of his assertions is that agnosticism is not a neutral position. So indecision is a decision in and of itself and has real-world consequences. So we'll be talking a little more about that later and why it's important. And his essay is in many ways structured in response to an essay by W.K. Clifford. So a bit of background for Clifford. He was a mathematician and a philosopher. So he's coming from a slightly different background, very different background than James. And he wrote an essay called The Ethics of Belief. And unfortunately, he died very young from tuberculosis, so he never had a chance to respond to James's criticisms. So in The Ethics of Belief, Clifford's central claim is that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And this is something that James takes great issue with. So we'll be getting into that later. So for anyone who has read The Will to Believe, you'll know that James does a lot of preliminary work, a lot of setting up before he gets to his central claim. So a couple things to keep in mind as we go through are how he sets up options and categorizes options. So options that we have can either be living or dead, forced or avoidable, or momentous or trivial. So what does he mean by this? So a simple example that I gave in my paper for like a living or dead option is like a dead option for us would be, or a dead concept is the world is flat. That's not something that any of us are really going to believe or even have any sort of inclination to believe or possibility of believing. A living option is the world is round. That's something that we believe, or at the very least I hope we're okay with that idea or being, have a sympathetic ear to that. So forced and avoidable. So James defines a forced option as one which the chooser cannot get himself out of. There's an ultimatum being made, while an avoidable option is exactly what it sounds like, avoidable. So James offers the following statements as examples. Either accept this truth or go without it, which is forced, and either call my theory true or call it false, which is avoidable. So the first statement is forced because it offers no room for a neutral response. The respondent must either accept or reject the truth, because to avoid acceptance or rejection altogether would be in itself a tacit rejection. But the second statement leaves room for equivocation. The respondent can refuse to offer judgment on the theory altogether. And he defines a genuine option as something that falls under all the categories of living, force, and momentous. And he argues that religion qualifies as a genuine option for many individuals, and it is this belief that he's interested in providing a rational basis for. So let me see here. Let me see. Okay, so he has a lot of criticisms of Clifford, and we'll be getting to this quote in a minute. So he argues that Clifford, going back to actually this quote back here, that Clifford suffers from a phobia of error. So he argues that he's basically, to use the famous phrase, he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like he paints him as so intent on not being duped that he will miss the truth when it comes by. And then, so he offers a lot of examples where he calls it, the way he phrases it, he says that faith in a fact can help create that fact. So he gives like an example of interpersonal relationships, like if you want someone to like you, but you hold out for sufficient evidence of that, they're probably not going to like you because you're not going to be approaching them. You're not going to be, you're going to be kind of standoffish. So they're not going to like you. So you kind of have created that situation. And then he also talks about, there's like an example of organizations. So like a big university, you have to have some faith, James argues, that everyone does their part for the whole to work. And you can't always wait for sufficient evidence for that. But I think he sort of misrepresents Clifford here, getting to this quote here. So Clifford says that it's not just like a matter of, like he's not suggesting that we never take risks. Instead, he's suggesting that in the absence of objective evidence, we must make our decisions based upon probabilities of uniformity of nature. So Clifford gives the example of a child being burned by a fire yesterday, being afraid of the fire today, assuming that it's going to burn him again. And so there's not going to be objective evidence for everything in our lives, but we can use these observations to help guide us when that's absent. And James sort of glosses over this. So I think Clifford would say in James's interpersonal examples that you can take that risk and talk to the person and try because you want them to like you, and you don't have to hold out for the evidence because there's you can sort of assess somewhat the probability. And even, sorry, it's hard to see on this. Like I can't, it's too small. I can't see it. So he says, so basically this is how we, accrue knowledge. We have to take, minimal risks. We don't want to take too big of risks, but that's, if we are wrong, that adds to our body of knowledge so we can, move on and make more assessments about the future. So, anyway, so James offers, I just realized I totally missed one of the examples earlier about the momentous, or we'll get back to that. Anyway, sorry. So James offers more examples of faith creating fact in sort of with an example of job promotions. And I think this example is problematic because, again, if we look at what Clifford's saying, we can sort of we can make some of these observations. Obviously, it's not 100% foolproof that you're going to get a promotion if you follow these things, which is why I have likely in italics. But you can observe, we sort of have a general idea of the types of behaviors that people exhibit to move up the ladder. It might not happen because of things like nepotism and stuff like that, but then again, that's another observation that we can make that can help guide us in our decisions. So if we replace something like a job promotion with a concept like the afterlife or a deity, it gets, I think, more problematic. So I don't think James's examples are really analogous to religious belief because these things are not observable, which is what faith is all about. I mean, we do have some accounts from people around the world of having experiences, but it's really tough to say. It's not like a job promotion. We can't really observe that. So, let me see. So this brings us to James's ultimate argument. So I mentioned earlier that agnosticism, he argues, is not a neutral decision. Like he gives an example of a man who is he doesn't marry a woman because he's afraid that she won't be the perfect wife, and he's like holding out for evidence that she'll be a perfect wife, but he can't get that evidence without marrying her first. But he just doesn't do it. But that indecision comes to the same thing as if he had married a completely different woman, and if he had made a decision. So in both cases, it ends up that he has not married that first woman. So what James is concerned about here is that, this indecision can lead us astray. It can lead us astray from the truth. So when he talks about when a decision has to be made, this concept, again, going back to I'm blanking. When he talks about a decision that is, living, momentous, and forced, which is a genuine option. That's the phrase I'm looking for. And I realized that I forgot to go over momentous and trivial, but they're fairly self-explanatory. So a momentous decision is potentially once in a lifetime, very, has extreme consequences, and trivial does not. So when we have all these three categories together for an option, and there is no objective evidence, no decision is a decision itself. So why not let our will guide us, is what James is saying. Why let our indecision trap us lest we miss the truth, even if we risk error? But then that gets problematic. So this is his thesis here. We have the right to believe at our own risk any hypothesis that is live enough to tempt our will. So going from that, historically, we have quite a few situations where groups of people have had these genuine options. So James is trying to justify this religious belief in this way with the genuine options, but the way he qualifies this, there's a lot of different actions in history that would fall under what he's trying to define here. So I have a bunch of pictures up, but historically the Crusades, kamikaze pilots in World War II. We have mass suicides in the Heaven's Gate with the comet back in I think it was the 90s. We have Spanish Inquisition, and we have obviously the terrorist attacks September 11th, and we have problems with ISIL now. So all of these groups, they have members who these options are very much living. They're a live wire for them. They're momentous, certainly, and from their perspective, they're forced. So I don't think this is what James had in mind when he was writing his essay. But I think if you look at what he's saying, these things come under his categories. So that's a problem. So. And I think this is what Clifford is trying to avoid. Maybe Clifford goes a little too far in what he says, but he does sort of try to qualify it with the statements about looking at uniformity in nature. But this is what he's trying to avoid, because there's been so many different actions that have been justified in the name of belief all over the world. So. I think there are problems here, and when you have this justification of theistic belief, as he puts it, it opens up a host of potential scenarios which would be rational by James's standards, but which cannot be considered rational. as these examples suggest. So, of course, James's focus in his essay was rationality, not ethics. But you still have to examine the ethical ramifications of such a proposition because justification derives from rationality. So when you have groups like this, when terrorists can justify their acts based on rational claims of religious belief, you have to reevaluate the basis for that justification. And and a more benign example, I forgot just to end on this, is Santa Claus. I put that in my paper. So that's a more benign example of something that also I think would come under James's heading. So thanks for bearing with me. It's been a rough couple weeks. I'm happy that I could be here at all, honestly. So.